In the early hours of the 19th of December 1984, a car left the road and plunged to the bottom of a cliff on the rocky Kaikoura coast. The vehicle belonged to one of New Zealand's most notorious criminals, Ron Jorgensen, famous for his role in the country's first gangland-style murders.
Well, it's rather a mystery. We haven't found any injured or dead persons at the scene.
Ron Jorgensen had vanished and has been missing ever since. Had his colourful past finally caught up with him?
There had been an attempt to run him over and that he'd been warned that he was at risk.
Was Ron so miserable that he'd taken his own life?
He felt his life had gone by and he hadn't achieved anything, he hadn't any money, and he'd lost everything, and he was deeply depressed.
Or had double murderer Ron Jorgensen outsmarted everyone that night?
I don't see any evidence to support the fact that that wasn't a constructed event. There's no body, there's no blood.
26 years on, The Missing re-examines what really happened to Ron Jorgensen and picks up a trail that leads across the Tasman. At 9 a.m. on the 19th of December 1984, two fishermen spotted Ron's red Cortina on the rocks at the base of a 15-metre cliff. Local police initially assumed Ron's car had simply been stolen and dumped. Police went looking for Jorgensen to see if he knew what had happened and discovered Ron was nowhere to be found. Christchurch police were called in to help.
We were called by the local police, who were concerned about the accident scene. They didn't believe that it was credible. And I went up there with half a dozen or so detectives to carry out preliminary inquiries.
Police had the car, but no body. No one knew if Ron had survived the crash or if he'd even been in the car. At the time Ron Jorgensen vanished, he was living in a pokey caravan at the back of his father's house in Kaikoura. He was on life parole and surviving on odd jobs and petty crime.
He was painting a house belonging to a woman at South Bay, which is on the southern side of the Kaikoura Peninsula. He had access to the house primarily to water cannabis plants.
The house was only 8 kilometres from the crash site.
The last sightings of him were at that house on the day before the car was found at the bottom of the cliff.
A neighbour of the South Bay house saw him arrive there at 3 p.m. and heard Ron happily chatting to another man.
The voices were quite relaxed, quite normal conversational sort of tones.
At 8:45 that same night, Ron rang his ex-wife, Margot.
He said he was coming down to Christchurch to pick up his gear from the house.
However, for some reason, Ron didn't travel to Christchurch. And at 10:10, the neighbour again heard Jorgensen talking with a man, but this time they didn't see anyone.
We were able to tie down the movements of all his acquaintances and with alibis, etc., and we ruled any of them out. We have never been able to determine who the second person was at the address.
The next piece in the puzzle occurred a few hours later, just south of Kaikoura.
At 1 a.m. on the morning, a truck driver was travelling north on the coast road, and he came around the corner and the headlights lit up a Cortina car with the front wheels hanging over the cliff. There was a person standing by the car, and he was described as a tallish person, and he looked quite relaxed. He didn't look like someone who was under any particular stress.
We've found that there's nothing here to indicate what happened when that car went over the cliff, so we'll just have to widen our inquiries a little bit further.
I'd hardly sort of gone into town before I sighted this sign up on a railway shed which said, "Ron's gone, Ron's gone." And everybody had a theory.
There were those who didn't really believe that Jorgie would have committed suicide or gone off the road. He knew the place well. There was quite a feeling that it was an engineered disappearance, that it was his way to get out, perhaps start a new life somewhere.
Do you think there are people in Kaikoura that know for sure what happened?
No, a lot of guessing.
It's all guessing.
His close friends would feel better if they knew he was gone. Yes, I've heard.
If they knew for sure that's what had happened.
Yeah.
The case appeared to go cold. But about a month after his disappearance, a single clue surfaced.
We used to sit down on South Bay and swim there, and my father used to like fossicking around in the stones. He always hoped one day he'd find the beautiful piece of greenstone or a lovely shell or someone's diamond ring. And this day, of course, he dug up the hat, which normally, you'd have thrown away. But Mike immediately said, that's Jorgie's hat.
The hat was the final sign that Ron had been anywhere near the waterfront. Police were confounded there was no sign of Jorgensen, and if there was someone who knew what had happened, no one was talking. He had simply disappeared. To find out what may have happened to Ron Jorgensen, we need to look further back into his past. In every aspect of Jorgensen's life, there are clues that may explain his disappearance. The first and perhaps most obvious scenario to look at is murder. From an early age, Ron appeared to be destined for trouble. Growing up in Kaikoura, he liked to be known as the tough guy around town.
My first recollection of Jorgie was I was going home to my mother, to our house, and Jorgie came round the corner, and he was a lot bigger than I, and I was about, I suppose, 8 or 9 at the time. And he said to me, "Hey, you," he said, "the policeman's round the corner waiting for you." And I burst out crying and turned round and ran home. That's my first impression of him. I can remember him boxing in Kaikoura. He frightened me, you see.
Desperate to escape the sleepy seaside town, Ron left school at 14 and joined the Merchant Navy. Life on the ships was rough. Conflict settled with fists and knives, and Ron learned to hold his own.
He would show me scars on himself and he'd say, "Oh, that was a bullet." And he'd say, "Oh, this one here was a knife." And he'd got them at sea, he reckoned, in fights.
Eventually settling in Auckland, Ron struggled to find work and continued to throw his weight around.
He would chew a matchstick and walk around the pubs, and he'd come in and it was almost close to psychotic, and he'd see 3 pensioners there and he'd glare at them for a minute, and then he'd walk out.
And by 18, Ron was sent to Borstal, where he met a volatile inmate, John Gillies.
Now, Gillies was the sort of person who would have imagined himself as Machine Gun Kelly or something. When he was 16, he was on a boat, coal boat, went to Australia. He got hold of the gun over there and shot at the crew when he was drunk, and they had to disarm him. He was frothing at the mouth then.
Jorgensen and Gillies developed a close and dangerous friendship that continued long after Borstal, and may be a link to Ron's baffling disappearance. When Ron Jorgensen went missing in 1984, there was speculation that his criminal past had caught up with him, that he'd been murdered and his car dumped off the Kaikoura cliff.
He was a self-styled gangster, and he loved the women that went with it, and the money and the excitement.
By his early 20s, Ron Jorgensen had done a stint in prison as well as Borstal. On release from jail, he teamed up with Borstal mate John Gillies. They were dealing in drugs, booze and stolen property, and living up to their gangster reputations.
They used to walk around with their big coats on, like American mafia, with their collars turned up with the hats over their eyes. And they were involved in smoking marijuana before marijuana even became popular amongst the hippies. In the early 60s, they had access to marijuana.
But the partnership was heading toward disaster. While Jorgensen enjoyed playing the big-time gangster, Gillies was becoming increasingly unstable, blurring the line between fantasy and reality.
And I believe, and I've heard from several, that Gillies was astonished when he actually shot someone. He was still playing, still fantasy, only this time he didn't roll over from the fantasy and go to sleep in his cell. There he was suddenly on the run with two bodies.
It was on December the 4th, 1963, that Gillies and Jorgensen crossed the line. High on marijuana, they drove to 115 Bassett Road in Remuera, intent on settling a score with some criminal rivals. Gillies was armed with a machine gun.
They'd had the machine gun on single shot. They'd made these people kneel down, Spate and Walker, and they'd shot them dead. Of course, the publicity was immense. It was Chicago comes to Auckland, Riesling machine gun smuggled into Auckland, and rival beer houses and gangsters and so forth. At the time, it was big news, big news.
4 weeks later, Jorgensen and Gillies were arrested for the brutal murders of Kevin Spate and Frederick Walker. Gillies eventually made a confession. Jorgensen steadfastly denied any involvement and was shocked when he too was charged with the murders.
There was no evidence that Jorgensen had participated in the shooting. He was charged as an accessory on the basis that he knew that a gun was being taken over. He knew there was ammunition, he knew it was loaded. And on the principle of law, that made him an accessory, and that made him guilty of the murder. That was the Crown case.
The pair were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Jorgensen maintained he was innocent and was bitter that he was taking the rap for what he saw as Gillies' crime. The two soon fell out badly.
Jorgie said, I never actually killed Kevin Spate. He said, but I did the time, he said, and I expected that when Gillies was in there that he would have admitted that he was the one that had pulled the trigger. And he said there was bad blood between us. He said, in actual point of fact, what had happened, they'd had a fight in prison and Jorgie had urinated over Gillies.
The same month that Ron disappeared, John Gillies was due for release, and there were whispers that Gillies would seek revenge for what had happened in prison. But police and most others dismissed this talk as fanciful.
Gillies couldn't have hurt Jorgensen except by shooting him. He was a big man, Jorgensen, and he was quite a bit bigger than Dirk Gillies. I don't think Gillies hated Jorgensen to that extent, and I don't think Gillies had it in him anyway.
But Gillies wasn't Ron's only enemy. While on bail in Kaikoura, Jorgensen had continued to grow and deal dope, and there were rumours he'd fallen out with a local bikie gang.
He said his caravan had been broken into, and I went down there and someone had actually kicked the door open on it, and you could see the footprint from them, and there was someone from Picton, as I understand it.
We heard all sorts of rumours. There was one story we heard that there had been an attempt to run him over 10 days or so before this, and that he'd been warned that he was at risk. Well, we talked to all his acquaintances, and there was never any suggestion of that.
He was never going to get away from his criminal background, but on the other hand, I don't think by any means he was into big-time drug dealing at that stage.
He wasn't in that high level of offending that would generate any resentment or anything that might lead to his murder. In fact, all of the inquiries we made, there was nothing that indicated a motive for his murder.
Nevertheless, rumours continued to circulate, and 6 years after Ron's disappearance, the possibility of foul play was raised once again.
This was Ronald Jorgensen 7 years ago, and this is the reconstruction of a skull some people think may be his.
6 years after Ron Jorgensen mysteriously disappeared, the case hit the news once again.
This was Ronald Jorgensen 7 years ago, and this is the reconstruction of a skull some people think may be his.
The shape of the skull matched Ron's measurements, so authorities went to the trouble of commissioning a reconstruction of his head. But the effort was futile. The skull and the skeleton were not Ron Jorgensen's. With no real evidence to support the theory that Ron Jorgensen was murdered, another possibility has to be considered, that he committed suicide. By the time Jorgensen returned to Kaikoura, he'd spent a lifetime in prison fighting a murder conviction and a reputation as a hardened criminal. But while in prison, he displayed new talents.
He had remarkable artistic abilities, and also he could write. He wrote some beautiful stories for children and illustrated them. He wrote poetry, he wrote prose, he painted. There was a compassionate side to him. Once you got through that hard external kernel and you got to the inside, there was really quite a gentle side of Jorgensen.
I like to be termed as a truthful painter, and prison is a very grey place. You get patches of white here and there with dippers and things like that, but basically the colour of prison is grey.
After serving 10 years of his life sentence, Ron was granted a release by the parole board. He volunteered to crew on his friend's yacht and revelled in his newfound freedom.
And I've never seen a man so happy at sea. He just sort of hung from the bloody rigging and laughed and sang, and just to be out there in the freedom and the sky and the clouds and the sea. And it was just a pleasure to be with someone who was so happy. What we didn't know, of course, was that there was a posse of police who were following us everywhere.
But for this artist and infamous murderer, the newfound freedom was short-lived.
At that stage, when people came out of prison, they went on a sickness benefit, but the actual funds didn't go in their bank account for something like 6 to 8 weeks. And Ron said that when people came out of jail, they virtually had to go and commit another crime in order to live because they came out without any money.
Jorgensen couldn't resist the easy money offered by drug dealing, and the police were waiting to pounce.
He went back into the criminal lifestyle. He got caught. He got 18 months, but they made him do another 5.5 years. He didn't know when he was going to get out. Every time he went up to the parole board, they would give him another knockback. So he'd be doing a series of short 6 or 12-month sentences between the parole board. Time of great tension.
With his parole revoked, there was no limit set on Ron's life sentence. Time and again, his case was heard by the parole board, which recommended his release. But the government stepped in to keep the high-profile Jorgensen behind bars.
Jorgensen's life really is the example of a highly intelligent, highly sensitive man being crushed by the penal system.
There's nothing worse to do to a person than to offer the little carrot, and you think it's there and you think you're going to get it, and then just as you get to it, they take it away and put it back. So the goalposts are constantly changing. You're constantly thinking you're going to get out and you're not. That really screws your mind up big time. And Ron would have been terribly bitter about that. When he finally got out, when they finally opened the doors for him again, they put him in another prison. It was like an ersatz release. They put him in another prison, which was Kaikoura.
Getting beaten down again and again, many speculate that Ron may have taken his own life. But there's an issue with the suicide scenario. Ron Jorgensen's car appears to have run off the road the night he disappeared, but there was no one found in it. His Cortina had come to rest upside down on the rocks south of Kaikoura, with its roof crushed in and all 4 doors jammed shut. Detective Neville Stokes concluded that if there'd been a driver in the car when it went over the cliff, that person's body should have been trapped inside the vehicle. To verify his theory, we've brought in a team of experts to re-examine the crash. The first factor to establish is the speed the car was going at when it left the road.
Observation stored.
By using the latest laser technology to measure the height of the cliff and the distance the car travelled after it left the road, we can determine the speed of the Cortina and its trajectory as it crashed to the rocks below.
Observation stored. Changing pace.
The data gathered along with photos of the original scene have been sent for analysis to Professor John Raine, a vehicle crash analyst at the Auckland University of Technology.
In this case, what turns out is that the vehicle has gone off the edge of the cliff very, very slowly, and it's rotated off the edge of the cliff and effectively gone down the face of the cliff into the water and onto the rocks.
Using the measurements, we've created a number of animations to illustrate the path of Ron Jorgensen's Cortina. If the vehicle had been travelling even at a moderate speed, its trajectory would have taken it at least 20 metres beyond where it was discovered at the base of the cliff. But at a speed below 20 kilometres per hour, the car follows the path described by Professor Raine.
The tyre marks that I've been shown in photographs lead up to the edge of the cliff. They're not consistent with the vehicle having left the road out of control and slid towards the cliff.
Taking into account the sighting by the truck driver who saw the Cortina stationary with its front wheels hanging over the edge of the cliff, the evidence indicates the car was going so slowly that it initially grounded on the banked edge.
I have seen a photograph that indicates some gouge marks on the edge of the softer material just at the top of the cliff. That would suggest that a vehicle has been pushed over the cliff rather than having been driven over.
Having studied the speed, trajectory and damage to the vehicle, Professor Raine can now judge whether a body could have been flung out of the car on impact or would have stayed trapped inside.
The doors on the vehicle were closed at the time it was found, and looking at the crush damage to the roof of the car, this would suggest that it would not have been possible for a driver to escape from the vehicle after it landed on the rocks.
All the evidence indicates there was no one in the vehicle and that it was pushed over the cliff. This rules out accidental death and makes suicide highly unlikely. The only other possible explanation is that Ron Jorgensen deliberately disappeared. Desperate to escape his hometown or on the run from old enemies, Jorgensen had the motivation to leave. The question is, where did he go and how?
I thought, well, what better way to go? Get picked up at your doorstep and off to Aussie, no time.
"18 years after the gangland-style killings at Bassett Road, Ron Jorgensen was released from prison on strict conditions. He was sent back to Kaikoura, the small town he'd been desperate to escape from as a boy, and forced to remain there on life parole.
Kaikoura at the time was a small, sleepy little seaside town where nothing much happened. Pretty well a dead-end dump where there was nothing to do.
He had no job to come back to, and as a condition of his parole, Ron had to live with his retired father.
His dad had lived by himself for a long, long time, turned off the power at night, so there seemed to be a struggle with hot water. Jorgie lived in a caravan separately out in the house, and they would certainly have a few arguments. I said to him, how would he like to come and earn a few bob and groom some cars for me? And he thought that was wonderful, to actually give him a chance to re-establish himself.
Valeting cars allowed Ron a brief escape from Kaikoura, delivering vehicles to Christchurch with permission from his parole officer. But it also gave him the opportunity to rebuild his illegal enterprises.
He would go, wait till the pub closed at 10 o'clock, he'd hop in this big Falcon of his, come to Christchurch, pick up stolen property, and he'd just get them back at daylight.
I hadn't seen him for probably 6 or 8 weeks, and I said to him, "Well, Georgie, what have you been up to?" And he said, I've been over at Della's place helping her stack wood. And I said, "Oh gosh," I said, "you're so kind the way you look after that lady." As it turned out, Georgie stacking his wood had been stacking the wood nicely around and putting Nova roofing on top, and he had a cannabis nursery growing underneath it.
He would have continued as a matter of principle and as a matter of personal honour. He would have continued with criminal activity. He wouldn't have wanted administration to think they'd beaten him, and he wouldn't have wanted the criminal world to have thought that he had retired and that he'd been cowed by the authorities.
Ron appeared to have life under control. He'd reinvented himself as an artist, had his criminal income on the sly, and he'd met a new woman.
I didn't think he was a particularly good-looking man, but there must have been something about him. And he told me that he was coming back from Christchurch once, and he called in at the hotel, and this woman spotted him and came over and started to chat to him. So he invited her up to Kaikoura, and that was Anne, yeah.
He looked lost. If a stranger comes in, you make them feel welcome. And it was my local, and my friends, a couple of friends, had been talking about him that day, and it just seemed to be a weird coincidence. And I just went up and said hello.
Anne lived in Christchurch in the same neighbourhood as Ron's ex-wife, who he was sometimes granted leave to visit.
He would pop in and say hello, and the kids got to know him really, really well, and he was wonderful with them. But it wasn't like you could spend a weekend or stay the night. And the police would drive past at night without their lights on, shine a big spotlight up my drive. And I'd laugh inside because he wasn't there.
But not everyone loved him.
The thing is, the public didn't want him back in this town anyway.
No, they didn't like him coming back.
Right. They didn't want him here in the first place.
I think there was a large sector of the community that weren't very happy about him being here at all. I think there was a lot of people that actually hated him.
Ron was surrounded by small-town animosity and still bitter about his long prison sentence. He grew increasingly resentful of his strict parole conditions, which meant he was trapped for life in the small township of Kaikoura. He would lapse into dark moods.
Quite often he would come in about 11 o'clock in the morning, and he might say that he couldn't get up, that I want to hide under the sheets. When I see the daylight there, he said, I think I'm in prison in this caravan. He said he'd want to hide under the sheets, and he would freak out.
He called it the black dog. And even though it was great to be able to unlock the door where he lived and go outside, still felt encumbered by the rules of the parole.
By the end of 1984, Ron's black moods were becoming more frequent. 52 years old, stuck on life parole in boring Kaikoura and reduced to a small-town crook, he still faced the terrifying possibility of being caught and jailed again. Just weeks before he went missing, he was granted permission to leave Kaikoura for 3 days.
I'd known about Ron by reputation, during my time in prison, but I first met him on the 23rd of November 1984. Ron and I were both invited to be guest speakers at the launch of the Criminal Bar Association in Auckland. After we all went to dinner, Ron wasn't at all depressed that night. Ron was happy. Ron was out of Kaikoura. He spoke about how much he hated Kaikoura and about how it was a confined, small society where there was nothing to do. The only thing that he seemed unhappy about was the fact that he had to return to Kaikoura.
9 days later, Anne sensed something was wrong.
I can still see the sadness on his face. He would say, "Whatever happens, I love you. Never forget that."
Anne had been visiting Ron in Kaikoura. On the 2nd of December, she boarded the bus back to Christchurch.
And I had this urge to jump off the bus and go back and say, right, what's going on? And I can still see his face now, all these years later. I'm very sad.
Anne never got an explanation about what was troubling Ron. That would be the last time she saw her lover. Two days before he went missing, Ron Jorgensen was visited by a good friend, Tony Harris, at that time a well-known criminal. That evening, the two men drank together at a hotel in Kaikoura. Both Harris and the publican would later tell police Jorgensen was calm, but appeared to be distracted. The following afternoon, Ron was witnessed in the company of a mysterious stranger. The next day, he was gone. We know that Jorgensen's car was deliberately pushed off the cliff. 4 weeks after Ron's disappearance, a hat was washed up. This could be a clue pointing to Ron being in the car when it was pushed over. However, our analysis of the tidal flows in the bay show that an object from the accident scene would have been carried away from the location the cap was found. None of the theories of accident, suicide or murder hold up under investigation, which leaves the strong possibility that Jorgensen organised his own disappearance. He'd had a strong affinity with the sea, and the night he disappeared there was an unusual boat sighted in the Kaikoura harbour.
This big yacht, about 80 to 90 feet most probably, pulled up in the bay over here, narrowly missing one of our big sunken rocks out here, and that's what made me thought, ooh, what's that doing in here? Stayed the night and it was gone early the next morning, never to be seen again. The next day we found out that Ron had gone missing, and I just thought, oh, maybe that's how he got out of the country, was gone on this yacht. It just seemed funny that it had pulled up that night and gone early the next morning.
I knew that he'd been given special dispensation from the parole board to stay in Auckland for a few days after the talk in order to take care of some business. And when he went missing 3 weeks later, I always wonder whether or not the business that he stayed in Auckland to take care of was the business of arranging his disappearance.
I thought, this is what's been building up. To have proper freedom.
To those who knew him well, Ron's desperation to escape his parole and life in Kaikoura made the idea that he'd skipped the country highly probable.
It was a time of real mixed emotions. I felt sad because I really, really did miss him. But I was also glad, quite elated really, if he'd got away and experienced some freedom in life.
Ron would have loved to cock a snook, give the fingers to the Justice Department and get out of New Zealand completely. He would have loved that.
There was a final clue to how Jorgensen might have bankrolled a new life elsewhere. Ron's friend, Tony Harris, told police about an illicit stash of 20 grand Ron kept in his caravan. After his disappearance, a police search found no trace of the money.
He wouldn't have had any trouble at all, I don't think. and getting out of the country. And I don't think he would necessarily have had to pay a lot of money either. In fact, I know that people at that time didn't have trouble getting false passports. And having got a false passport, he could easily have changed his appearance. He was a seaman, he knew a lot of people who worked on ships, and he knew a lot of criminals. And in the criminal world, you do those things for your mates for nothing. You never ask for money, never.
On December the 19th, 1984, notorious gangster Ronald Jorgensen vanished. Officially, he was declared dead, but all the evidence suggests Ron faked his own death and absconded abroad. 2 years after he went missing, there was a crucial turn of events. An old school friend reported that he'd spotted Jorgensen in Perth.
So what did he do when he saw you in Australia?
Buggered off, took off, ran away into a car park. My two daughters were wandering around behind me and I was looking for them, so the wife followed him, but he ran away into a car park and disappeared.
There were others who claimed they'd sighted Jorgensen both in Australia and back in New Zealand, but police found none of these could be substantiated and the trail went cold. On re-examination of police files, we found there was at least one other credible witness.
That was the day that the casino opened, or the day after, and we were given free tickets to the free luncheon, so of course we were into that.
Barry knew Jorgensen well from a Christchurch rugby club where Ron owed him $50 for a raffle.
And we were standing in the queue waiting to get into the restaurant, and along came Ronald Jorgensen and another mate of his, and we got probably about 3 or 4 metres apart, and he looked up and spotted me, and I was about to say, "Hi, Ron," and he bolted, and his mate stood there looking around for him, and I just said to him, "Are you looking for Ronald Jorgensen?" And he must have sensed there was something up, and he bolted too.
If Ron Jorgensen did go to Western Australia to reinvent himself, there should be some trace of his living there and locals who'd recognise his face and personality. We've hired Peter Frampton, a private investigator based in Perth, to make inquiries.
We set about checking the records that were available to us in the form of electoral roll records, database searches electronically, and also what we have available to us in-house.
Not surprisingly, there's no sign of Ron on any official records, but our private investigator still hopes he can find leads.
In view of his colourful past, he may well have elected to come to WA and operate under one or more pseudonyms, and that may still be the case.
There were reports in Perth that someone fitting Ron's description had a stall selling art in the now abandoned Subiaco Pavilion Market. In 2003, a television news team even went to the market in search of Jorgensen.
You recognise him at all?
Can't say that I've seen the person before.
I don't recognise him, no. We're looking for this chap here.
I think he might have been in the markets about 16 years ago. Okay, it's a long time ago now.
And you're absolutely sure that you recognise this man here?
Yep. I'm pretty sure it's Ronald. Okay.
Is that the name he went under?
Yep, and he was a painter.
When we contacted Tracy, she was reluctant to offer any more information other than suggesting that Ron may have died in 2001, aged 69. When we asked if she'd appear for an interview, she became evasive and told us she no longer works at the markets. Perhaps the story of Ron's death was simply a ruse to help him cover his tracks. Could there be others from the market who remember Ron? When the Subiaco Pavilion Market closed down, a handful of stallholders moved to the Station Street markets nearby. It's possible someone there may recognise our missing man. In case they too are shy of the camera, Peter's making it a little less obvious. The market is full of people on a Saturday, and it didn't take Peter long to find someone who said they knew Ron.
Yeah, I remember him, definitely. I remember him, definitely.
Yeah.
Believe me, even I know how he likes his coffee. Always he come to me for a cup of coffee. 100%.
He was a good bloke, actually. He didn't really talk very much to people. You know, he used to come and have something and just go back to his place.
When do you think it was the last time you saw him, roughly?
I believe over past 6 years, over.
Yeah. What did you know him as, Ron?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't remember the name Jorgensen? Does that ring a bell? No.
The most important for me, he was a nice guy. I don't know anything more than that.
Yeah.
Two stallholders are adamant they recognise Ron. But how long ago did they last see him?
Well, I came here 7 years ago. That's when he was here, I think. And after a year or year and a half, 2 years after I was here, I kind of left.
The positive sightings mean there is a strong possibility that Jorgensen is alive and living in Western Australia.
We did hear that he had gone up the coast somewhere, possibly even to Broome. There are various people of the artistic world that do go up the coast, and Broome is one of those places. I'd like to think there's still a chance of him being out there in Western Australia somewhere, and that the word will filter back to him that, we want to talk to him, and he'll come forward.
Leaving the market, we met one final witness, a regular for many years. After only seeing our photos of Ron and with no prompting, Dorothea was happy to tell us about the man she immediately recognised.
Ron, wasn't it? Yeah. I think he's had a girlfriend or something, but he moves around, so nobody. He's a smart one, that one. So he'd be in his 80s, I think. Good 80s. It wasn't my cup of tea. Look at him. Oh, he's a woman lover. Is he in jail yet?
It seems almost certain that Ron Jorgensen, notorious gangster, convicted double murderer and celebrity artist, decided to voluntarily disappear in December 1984. He staged a car accident to look like he'd died before fleeing. And there is strong evidence that he's been living anonymously in Western Australia. He may still be walking the streets of Perth at 78 years old, determined to remain one of the missing.
He was colourful. If he sat down here, he would have you in stitches. You know, he could certainly spin a good story, a good storyteller.
I'd just love to say hello and shake his hand and give him a hug and thank you for the memories and the experience of knowing you. It would be nice.
He would have loved to have got out of there and disappeared completely and been the mystery man and create the legend that he is. If he's alive today, he'll be loving it.